Hello. This is hopefully a short, little video about Darktide. I wanted to make one that was about what makes a game feel complete, or worth putting your time into. I was really excited for it on release. Its all-time peak of players was about 108,000, so a lot of people were excited along with me. But the game petered out fairly quickly in terms of its popularity and its excitement. Typical complaints were that missions were all the same visually and in terms of their pacing, perks were totally unbalanced, and challenges oriented around doing stupid, unrealistic things that just got you in danger, that sort of thing, like a Dead by Daylight challenge. Well, for survivors anyways. Also, Darktide proved to be a little bit unsatisfying in the long term because of its itemization and its grind. Now, grind is obvious because weapons often needed the right blessings and stats to be able to feel like that they behave the way that you wanted them to behave. It took a long time to get there, so as a result, it was very, very grindy. Now, what killed it for me personally was a lack of agency and progress. A lot of people bounced off of it for a lot of reasons, and most of that relates to the game not being done. It's never been a massive success, but it has had a fairly consistent base of about 4,000 to 5,000 people. Now, I'm no Darktide historian, but here's a general rundown as I remember it. The greatest base was at release, which is highly typical for any game. It's not unusual to see a very sharp drop-off. So it began with 108,000 people on Steam charts in December of 2022. And it also released on Xbox, so a little bit more players were on that as well. Now, it lost almost all of its base in 2 months, and that's the issue. It went down to 4,300 by February. Now, sometimes that's a big deal, sometimes it's not. It had very similar numbers to Vermintide. That's a stable population, though, of about 4,300 people, and that's kind of just where it stayed for the rest of its lifetime. More of the issue is that it got there in 2 months, with a mixed review. Now, as I mentioned, what harmed it on release is that it felt like a beta. It didn't have much content, it had an offensive cosmetics store, it had bad cosmetics that were free in general, terrible item drops, constant crashing, bugs, that sort of thing. Not many missions were there, and most were very similar, so the experience felt incomplete to some people. And as I mentioned, the outfit cosmetics were basically 2 or 3 recolors of the same uninteresting models. Weapons were just a red version of the same model. A lot of UI elements were also very messy or poorly organized, along with making your character run around a massive hub just to be able to access the basic features. The game felt incomplete. There were a lot of features, but some of them were obviously neglected in favor of other ones. Anyways, like I mentioned, my main reason for bouncing off the game was a lack of progress agency, and I'll explain that. The income game of the game was very, very slow. The resources that you would get from completing missions were used to re-roll RNG'd items from a table, or go to the shop and then buy terrible items from that store. So you would play a few missions to get enough resources for a terribly generated RNG item, see that it's worth nothing, trash it, and as a result have 0 cash. So you were consistently playing the game and making no progress whatsoever. Weapons had mark varieties as well eventually that made some of the differences between them very confusing because they had the same name but they were technically a different model. And it was also very hard to try weapons because you had to rely on actually getting one in order to try it at all, and usually it was going to be a terrible profane weapon with really bad stats, so you didn't want to keep it anyways. So in the process of not engaging with the system, you would not know what exactly is important as far as stats go, what the blessings did, and so on. It was all random, so you couldn't work towards any personalization or learn really anything about the system at all. Now, this is a case of the developer intent being different from the player intent. If you got a high rarity item, you just used it until you found something better, maybe, even if it wasn't your taste. It was sort of like playing a loot or a Diablo game. For a lot of players, determining what was better sometimes just wasn't possible. Items have gear scores, but they're just totaling stats with no way of trying different variants to see what they even do. In the shop, the highest score was supposedly 480, but players reported sometimes seeing up to like 488. The developer said it was just a UI bug, but it's still a bug to this day, and you can't really be sure one way or the other. So the game became playing just enough to have a lot of resources that you just never spend. Then you log into each one of your characters every hour at the shop when it reset, as it updated, to look and see the randomly rolled items to see if they're any good. Then you would see that none of them are, so you would log out and then try again in another hour. So some people started making phone apps. You see where this is going? that use your login information to be able to read what the items in the store would be generated as, so that you wouldn't be forced to actually launch the game in order to evaluate anything worth having inside of it. So a lot of my playtime was letting the game idle open and not actually playing it. And for even more people, they would simply look at their phone and never play the game because the game became looking at the store to see what the RNG items were. Now, YouTubers and data miners were the main source of information on what an ideal weapon even might be, because most players didn't have any ability to interface with the system because everything was random. And as I said, the developer intent did not match the player intent, so it should come as no surprise that the developers tried to play up the idea of celebrating getting god roll weapons, instead of actually working towards anything. Instead of actually trying to fix the system, they started celebrating Reddit threads of people posting things that they thought were good generated items because they're so rare to actually see, which frustrated a lot of people, myself included. Now, FatShark has an online identity of being very hard-headed as a studio, and very condescending to players. Vermintide went through a very similar issue of releasing the game as sort of a mess, lots of complaints came in, but FatShark willfully resisted the idea of improving the game in the way that players wanted it to improve, and then after years of this, they eventually acquiesced and did what the players wished, and then it became a better game. So a lot of Vermintide veterans were in Darktide telling them just use the Vermintide system because that's what they knew, and they knew that that one worked. But FatShark made it clear in statements that they wanted a new system that was distinct from Vermintide, so they just ended up restarting the same cycle of complaints and resistance and so on. You can see this in their updates, them actively fighting players, telling them to just let them upgrade their stats. Early patches ignored progression and itemization issues entirely, and later ones sort of bargained with the players. In February, when people were leaving, they added the ability to buy specific profane items that always generated with terrible stats anyways, and they also added the ability to extract blessings and change one while locking the other one, which was slightly better, but still absolutely terrible. They also added in the Emperor's Gift system, so that after a 20 to 40 minute long mission, you might get an item, although they were always trashy items that you wouldn't want to use anyways. Now, in March, they made green weapons, the rarity, stop dropping at higher difficulties, assuming that one dropped at all. They also made weapons stop generating under 300 power. After asking what the hell does that mean, people were still wanting 480 plus gear score items, but accepting 400s as usable garbage that they had no personal connection to. So with 480 as the perceived max, you can see why weapons generating as 300s was something that was just laughably terrible. From these supposed improvements, they got a brief uptick of a few returning players who just immediately left. Now, there was a massive update in October that drew in about 14,000 players, and what did this one do? It did nothing to itemization, again, but it just rebalanced the game with lots of perk changes and class changes, things like that, and lots of quality of life features. Now, the point here is that now it felt a bit more like a game that was actually out of beta, but it still had the exact same issues. For a long time, all the patches were bug fixes or rebalancing numbers, no attempt to actually fix the core issues that some people had with the game. So eventually all those 14,000 players slowly dwindled away, and it reverted back to having about 4.5k players concurrently. And that is an important thing to note, that the patches were adding a little bit of content, it would bring in a few amount of players, then it would slip back down to a stable number of around 4,000 or so people. Now, it seems to me they were aware that the experience was not a complete one, and FatShark had a long-term goal of aiming to keep slowly adding things until they can market the game as a more complete experience with more major patches, sort of a No Man's Sky situation. And that is likely why it always takes them so long as a studio to fix what is clearly to some people broken, and why they seem so stubborn. They're aware it's not a good platform to launch with for a live service game, when it's so incomplete. If you tried to instantly give the game proper itemization on release, people would probably have raced through all the content and felt no connection to actually returning to anything new because everything had been completed. Even if there were new missions, they wouldn't really have any long-term goals left. Now, if you delay it by literally years, you can retain people that are addicted to the specific gameplay loop, and then you are able to also attract people later with a more complete experience with whatever it is that they're looking to engage with. Now, I mentioned No Man's Sky, that's probably the most famous example, but it's way more common these days to see modern games released with a concept that you end up fixing over a period of years, and then afterwards you use some sort of major update to heavily market the game almost as a re-release. For some people, the experience was absolutely complete on day one. The general gameplay hasn't changed that much, after all. In the Space Marine 2 video that I made recently, I got comments stating that my ideas for a working melee system that balances waves with difficulty correctly is actually a Darktide system, and I just inadvertently stumbled upon it. I couldn't remember much about Darktide's general gameplay because I bounced off it so hard, and that reminded me that the game existed at all. Now, I had checked back about a year ago, but I immediately gave up when I realized that the itemization and RNG issues were still exactly the same and had all the same time-wasting mechanics associated with them. But to my surprise, on September 25th, the unlocked and loaded version of the game was released, or re-released, and that's what fixed the game, quote-unquote, for me. Now, in this version of the game, it lets you improve your weapon classes by just gaining XP with the weapon. And as you gain higher mastery, it lets you swap out blessings on that weapon however you like. You don't have to worry about unlocking them or anything like that. As long as you have used the weapon enough, you can just fix it however you want to. Maxing out a weapon also lets you use resources to max out all those stats. So even if it generated poorly, you can still end up with a perfect weapon. But there is a distinction in that weapons still come with max possible values that are different across the stats. So you still have to evaluate weapons to see what it is that you're aiming for. So while weapons do still generate with terrible stats, you can find one with the potential to be good, and that's just much easier to deal with. So it's still not a perfect system. You can't change the dump stat of a weapon or adjust them to change its feel and so on. And you can also fly through all the blessing unlocks very quickly, so I could see other people, not me, being done quote-unquote quickly if they only cared about one thing, like grind. Plus, due to the nature of there being so many weapons, you can still end up with UI clutter. If weapons were always owned, like you always had just one of them, but they were modular, upgradable items that just never changed, and they had slots so that you could perfect them to make them look however you want it to look. You could probably make it look more like the Penance UI, which is much cleaner looking, but it's probably not the experience that they're going for. So it's pretty close to being perfect for engaging with the game, for me. Because I put no value whatsoever on grind, I love exploring personalization, and I like trying out lots of builds and weapons, then rotating between them. That's my personal complete component and what keeps me actually wanting to engage with the game. Whereas before, I had no interest in even trying. It'll be different for everyone. And yes, Darktide's melee system of regenerating toughness based on lots of different factors is almost exactly like my idea in the Space Marine 2 video, and much better than what Space Marine 2 is desperately trying to do, with pairing being the only solution to every single problem. Like, usually in Darktide you die because your frontliner was ignoring their job and just off having a good jolly time somewhere, or a veteran dive bombs into a mob in the corner of the map, and you stop getting group bonuses to your toughness regeneration as a result, or something like that. Or just a ton of gunners just suddenly unload on you from out of nowhere. That happens too. But it's generally a good system, especially now that you can actually make a build and have weapons that you want, instead of just cobbling a build together out of weapons that you don't really want, but still generated with good stats, I guess, that you have no personal involvement in. Now my main complaint is cosmetic. A lot of classes still have terrible style. Oddly enough, Ogrins have great drip. They look amazing. Psykers and Zealots generally look very samey and unimpressive to me. I'm sure there's like one or two okay-looking ones. But almost all good cosmetics are in the store, the paid store, which is still way overpriced. And it also still uses a fear of missing out rotating FOMO store. That is, something new will appear and then it will vanish in a couple of weeks, and it might show back up at some other time. FOMO makes me completely disengage from that system, which is why I never spent my pre-order currency. If I can't see all my options, then it makes me think that there's probably something that I'm not seeing that I prefer more, so I just end up not wanting to buy anything. To see what is actually in the game and might return, you would need to use fan wikis that compile pictures of the things. So this is probably the last of the release systems that were absolutely terrible that still remain absolutely terrible. Also, being able to dye your gear would be nice, but that'll probably never happen. Anyway, the method of engagement for players in Darktide is an odd one. For some, it's about the core gameplay loop and they don't care about the rest. For others, it's about having something to do, so they actually like the grind. No more than about 4K concurrent players out of 100,000 anyways. And for many others, it's about the missions and not wanting to be so tired of them by having a robust amount of them so that they can rotate through them. For people like me, it's the personalization of a build and enough variety to keep rotating between those. The platform itself seems designed with that in mind, though. FatShark knows that they can release a major update, attract some interest, and then after about 2 months or so, those players will slowly fade away. So they'll work again on making a new update, release that, and then the cycle repeats for increased monetization. It's an interesting issue in design, and sometimes you have to release and plan content around that sort of problem. Now, was the game using terrible itemization for a long time because FatShark knew one type of player would stay for that, while others would just wait around? Now, whether FatShark is just willfully stubborn and thinks, no, it is the children who are wrong, or were they perfectly aware that they were going to have to fix this itemization issue later on and they just weren't ready yet? Who knows? For now, I would say that Darktide is a much better game than it used to be, and an interesting encapsulation of this kind of problem. It is worth playing. Hope you enjoyed this video. Check it out. See you guys next time.